Hello and welcome to another episode of Law and More. My name is Kate Ryan. I'm a family law partner at IBB Law, and in this episode I'm going to be talking to Michelle Hoskin, who is Director and Founder of Standards International. We are going to be talking about a really important topic: financial control and economic abuse. So Michelle, tell us a little bit about yourself.
With pleasure. So I'm Michelle Hoskin, as you've introduced me, the founder and director of an organisation called Standards International. So effectively, Standards International is a standards certification body operating mainly in the financial services and professional services sector. It's been a business that's been my baby, I suppose, a real passion project for me over the last 25 years. And more recently, we've got more involved in training and coaching financial planners and advisors and other professional advisors in the area of financial abuse and economic harm. A real key point, a real key area that's definitely becoming much more mainstream now over the recent few years, particularly triggered by obviously the COVID experience that we all had as families.
So perhaps the first place to start is to talk about what financial control and economic abuse is. Certainly from my perspective, dealing with domestic abuse and coercive control and all the umbrella headings that covers dealing with my clients, financial control is something that falls under the category of coercive control. It is where a person prevents somebody access to funds, restricts the amount of money that they have to buy things, takes away any access to any funds that they may have, and uses this in a really nasty and manipulative way to control them. There are specific definitions of coercive control, but I think because we're talking about this specific element of financial control, let's just focus on practically what that means, how it affects people, who it affects, and what there is out there to try and raise awareness and help victims of coercive control, specifically financial control. And Michelle, given what you do in your business, perhaps you could talk to us a little bit about your experience of dealing with the area of financial control, the vulnerabilities that you see in people and how you consider this needs to be dealt with.
Absolutely. I think if we actually think about it, not in a professional capacity, but I think if we actually think about it from us just being people, and we looked into our family groups, our friendship groups, I think actually if we thought about it and almost, really just looked inside, we would probably, even if we weren't sure, we would be able to spot and have an inkling or a gut instinct that there was some form of control happening in many of the relationships and friendships that we even might have as women, right? So I think what I would say is my linking kind of back to, why I even got involved in this, because I think that sort of sets the scene to, talk more about, my experiences. But, I have this real passion that as an individual that everybody has the I suppose the permission and the they should have everything that's potentially there at their disposal to thrive as a human. I think life is so short, and one of the things that saddens me greatly is when any person, male or female, they have their ability to be economically, empowered or economically in control or economically thriving, taken away from them by a perpetrator in this case. So I think, we all have that privilege. We should all have that privilege and that ability to thrive in our lives. And effectively, financial control, as you just said there, Kate, is where somebody else, a perpetrator, so let's call that person B, uses money. That their power, money is power. And when they use that to exert control over person A, it can be terribly detrimental. And we all know, I've spent a lot of my years working in financial services and professional services, that we know that money makes the world go round, and money gives us power. And the second that somebody either restricts our access to it, sabotages what we have or prevents us from or exploits our, economic power, our financials, it's devastating, because without that, we are almost powerless. Without money, without access to what we need, we are all absolutely powerless. And that is why it is such an important area area and why the changes in the Domestic Abuse Act, those big legal changes, which I'm sure we'll talk about today, they're going to make a massive impact. So I think, we all have our need to be economically stable, economically empowered, to buy, at basic level, the things that we need, clothing, housing, food, and, whether we'll touch on the whole economic crisis is one point, but, if that's done deliberately by a perpetrator, person B, like I say, it can be absolutely, devastating.
Given that you've just raised the Domestic Abuse Act, I think perhaps it's a good point to talk about that. The Domestic Abuse Act is relatively new, and the most important thing about this piece of legislation is that it does deal with financial control and coercive control. Effectively, what the Act does is it makes coercive control a crime. And the Act goes much, much further than just providing definitions and making people aware of what this particular form of behaviour is. It also sets down some fundamental principles for society about how important it is to have people in charge of certain areas in society to make sure that victims are dealt with properly, both through the justice system and ongoing. So when their relationship ends, for example, it flags up how important it is to have people in government that deal solely with this area of coercive control and domestic abuse. And there's lots more to that piece of legislation that we could have a whole podcast on. But ultimately, linking it back into the financial control arena, what it means is that there is a definition of coercive control. Financial control comes under that. It is a criminal offence, and it means that somebody that is a victim of financial control has some form of sanction. There are consequences to perpetrators' actions. The issue, certainly in my field and what I see, is that it's very difficult to piece all of these things together to actually put forward a case within the justice system. But it is getting better, and I see firsthand from judges in the court system that they are becoming a lot more aware of coercive control and financial abuse, and that these are patterns of behaviours that actually, as you said, really, really impact a person's life. And financial control is one aspect of that.
I think it might be a really good point also as an extension of that to just talk about the difference between abuse and harm, because I know there's an awful lot of stigma around, because obviously, economic abuse, coercive control falls under the sort of the definition of domestic abuse. And by nature, the term abuse can be quite scary. For both potential perpetrators, but equally for victim survivors also. And we've done quite a bit of work, as other organisations have, around the difference between abuse and harm. And I think if anyone's listening to this, almost thinking that abuse is about a physical or sexual act or a violent act, harm may be a way of almost not softening the seriousness of the subject, but actually making it a little bit more easier to digest from a conversation perspective or from just an acceptance. You asked me before about some of the, the experiences. Well, I recorded a podcast a few years ago, and the guy that was interviewing me, I was on screen with him, and the whole way through, he's literally like staring at me like I'd been teleported from outer space, honestly. And when the podcast had finished, he was like, "Oh my God, Michelle," he's like, my brother's doing it to his wife. And he literally had absolutely no idea. And it was only because of the things that I was explaining, the characteristics of behaviour. And he said, but God, he said, if I ever went to him and said, you're abusing your wife, he said, all hell would break loose. He said, but harm is a perfect word. And he said, I'm going to speak to him and say, I think you're putting your wife in economic harm, in financial harm. And then he told me afterwards that he'd had this conversation with him, and the brother had no idea that he was even doing it. Like, he wasn't a narcissist. He was just a guy who had just got over careful with money, super controlling, but not through nastiness, but just through care. And I think that's an important point as well. Control versus care. There's a I'm super caring about my family, and then there's using finances to control, and that's the very fine line, which is often overstepped, I think.
Yes, I completely agree with that. And that is an important distinction, because obviously, like you say, abuse is something that is intentional mostly, isn't it? And certainly with coercive control behaviour, financial control, any form of controlling behaviour which has the effect on the victim of demeaning them, belittling them, limiting, like you said right at the beginning, limiting their life and their ability to thrive. From my perspective as a family lawyer, this is always an intentional step.
Absolutely.
An act of control, and often does relate back to certain personality types. And the difficulty within the family law system of dealing with this type of behaviour is trying to make a case that will be successful from an injunctive perspective and or a criminal perspective if it is very serious. And that is something that the Domestic Abuse Act will help with. And I think it's pretty obvious from my perspective that financial institutions, there is lots of advertising in all sorts of media at the moment, and has been for quite some time, about how important and sadly how common coercive control, financial control actually is.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, and I talk to my parents. I mean, my parents are like, late 60s. And when I use the word abuse, they instantly think of physical. And I think what's really important about, there's lots of stats floating around. You only have to Google economic harm, and there's stats online just popping up at you all the time. But I think a couple of things that are important. I think, there's a certain surveys that, say that 33% of, those experiencing some sort of financial control, that control started at the beginning of the pandemic, so early 2020. And I think that's important, and that's that differential between control and care, right? I think the other key point, particularly in the work that you do during separation and divorce, is that I don't physically have to be in the same room as you to effectively, coercively control you or financially put you in any harm or abuse you. I physically have to be in the room if I'm going to exert, physical abuse over you. And that's why it's so horrendous, because there's absolutely no escape from the perpetrator for this form of abuse. It's horrific. And I think the other point of it is that, it can go on for years and years and years. I was chatting to a lady that, she'd been a victim for 35 years. And she actually probably only realised it in her 34th year that it was actually a form of abuse, because it had become normal. She'd found herself making excuses for her husband, covering for him, at dinner parties, almost excusing him from his behaviour. He'd had a busy day, or, and these are some of the signs that actually, from a victim survivor's perspective, that there could be something wrong. But deep down, I believe that a lot of the time we have this sixth sense, we all have it, that gut instinct that, this feels wrong, but we all do it. We all brush it under the carpet. Oh, it's just me having a bad day or whatever. But we need to listen to ourselves much more. And I think we would spot that in our friends and our family groups, and in, friends that are going through, separation in the areas that you help them in.
Yes, I can relate to that as well when speaking to clients that perhaps don't realise they're in these controlling relationships. Versus clients that have come to that realisation and moving them forward from that. And I think that's an area that I also share your passion in, because when I see clients going through the traumatic time of dealing with a separation or a divorce, as well as dealing with an element of financial control or coercive control, it doesn't just end the moment that the relationship ends. No. It's ongoing because of what they may have suffered throughout the relationship, and because as you've alluded to, it can carry on after the relationship. So just because that person is removed from the relationship doesn't mean that the control stops. And that's another important thing about the legislation that's come in. And I think the amount of awareness that's being raised in the media because of what's going on in the world, that people do realise that, and there needs to be protection in place for those people that can't just shut the front door, off they go, and they are sort of, they're able to
Free
then
from it.
be free because they're not.
Yeah, I think also it comes down to this. The reason that form of control is so powerful is because what a perpetrator does is they use it, whether it be during a relationship or post a relationship, to reduce and limit the space for control. So if you remove the things that I need, I become dependent, I become submissive to the perpetrator's control, and that's where the coerciveness. And just while we're on that sort of point, because we've mentioned the word coercive control quite a bit already, what you mentioned, the word sort of recurring. So if there's a single event, it probably wouldn't be deemed as coercive control. It's a single event. It's where there's a repeatable pattern of anything is where coercion comes in, right? And that can be, through emotional, the words that somebody uses with somebody, whether they restrict or do something to do with money, or the physicalness. It's reducing a person's space for action, and ultimately to create them to be a subordinate, a submissive to a more dominant party. And many use money to do that. And and any time there's a bond of children, property, business. I was actually interviewing a chartered financial planner, super qualified, this lady. I mean, a successful businesswoman in her own right. And she said, I was a victim for 15 years of financial control. And she said, and when I went to court eventually, the judge, I hope this would never ever happen today. And this was 15 years ago. And she said, the judge said to her at the time, of all people, you should know better. Right. And, she's now dealing with PTSD as a result of the fact that her partner effectively over the duration of their relationship put her into a constant state of fight and flight. And effectively what PTSD is a person's inability to come out of that state. So you're going to be dealing with people daily who have had horrendous marital breakdowns, potentially male or female, that are actually suffering from PTSD. And they have to deal with that first before they can actually get their head around even going through that process. So I think it's brutal. But the question you asked me earlier, which was, who does this affect? Anybody that breathes. It can affect children. I've heard of stories where, you've got a mum and dad separating with older children. There's family wealth, and the children are a victim of financial control because the mum or the dad is saying, well, I'm going to cut you out of the will if you go and live with your mum. Or I'm going to cut you out of the business estate or the family estate or whatever if you go and live with your dad. I mean, it's horrific because we all know that money allows us to thrive. So it's any gender, it's any culture, it's any age. It peaks and troughs in certain areas. And I read a piece a little while back where, and this was almost, I suppose, we believe or we think, and this is the stigma that sits with it, is that, it's those who are, I'm going to use the poor housewife kind of analogy, but we know what I mean, like the vulnerable that is vulnerable. And I read this whole article on the fact that, also, which is not necessarily as high, but women with economic power of their own are often targets of financial control and economic harm, because effectively, and that can be from a man, a woman, coming from whoever, could be from a business partner, right? Could be from anybody, because effectively, let's say I'm the economically, financially, powerful woman, they want what I have. Or they want what I'm able to continually generate. So, there's horrendous, some of the stories. I mean, they're just awful. I mean, you're experiencing them daily, probably.
I sadly have seen lots of really traumatized people that have been in really coercive and controlling situations and relationships, some of which have formed financial control has been part of that behavior. And other than the fact that it's really awful to hear about, I think what really impacts me as well is just how much it affects their ability to thrive and live, and their confidence, their ability to parent, all of the things that you've rightly raised. And so as a family lawyer, I sort of take it on board as part of my responsibility. Is yes, I'm there to advise them about the law and what their options are in any given situation. But likewise, I need to be able to also point them in the right direction for those other resources that are available to them that can also support them on this relatively mammoth journey of being able to extricate themselves from this relationship, make really vital decisions about what they now need to do, both in terms of their finances, in terms of their housing, their parenting, all of those things that at that point in time, let alone the fact that they've probably been knocked down to, a fraction of their former self, they need to start thinking about and make decisions on. And that is not really anything that us as lawyers are able to do, but it's really, really important that we have around us a network of good people that we can refer these clients to, that can also hold their hand on the journey and give them the support that they need.
Yeah, it's absolutely vital. You used the point just briefly there about, depleting resources. I remember sharing on social media, I picked it up from social media a while back, and it was basically a picture of a frog in a big vat of water. And, the sort of the tale that went alongside that post was, if you put a frog into a vat of cold water and turn the temperature up, by the time the water is boiling, the frog has depleted its own resources. It has no resources in order to get itself out of that vat of water. However, if you put a frog into a vat of boiling water, it would try and jump out. And that in a sort of an analogy is coercive control. And you imagine that with the money. I think just going back to one of the points you just picked up on, I chatted to a lady who was part of a charity. And she was telling me a story about a lady who was from the sidelines, from the outside, was living in a very affluent life, children in private school, beautiful big house, drive around in a posh car. And this particular lady had eventually reached out to a charity, domestic violence charity, and said, I need some help. But the story she told was that she'd actually been to see, first of all, a lawyer, to find out what her rights were. And the lawyer, because she was lacking confidence, the lawyer missed all the signs. Literally, I can imagine they were blaringly obvious, but the lawyer missed them. She then went to see a financial advisor. So the lawyer couldn't help, said, we can help you, when he sold some of his businesses. Well, even if he sold all of his businesses, she was never going to see a penny of the money anyway, and he would fight her for it through divorce, right? Then she went to see a financial advisor, a highly qualified financial advisor, who actually said to her, and for any financial advisors that are listening to this will know exactly what I mean when I say this, he said to her, well, we can help you when the time is right. Effectively, we can help you when you have some money to either invest. And 3 weeks later, she took her own life, and she left 2 beautiful boys. The impact on hundreds of people of her taking her own life. And she went to 2 professionals, neither of which could help her and didn't help her. And this poor lady's now dead. I mean, it's horrendous. And I think there are uber amounts of stories like that. And that's why the professionals and effectively what we're actually talking about in the truest form, Kate, is creating what's called a coordinated community response. And that's not just about the charities helping victims and perpetrators, as well, but also the wider professional advisors, lawyers, accountants, life coaches, management consultants, banks, building societies, you name it, anybody that comes into contact with humans who are advising them in some capacity of what to do with their life. And I think, we've all got a huge duty of care. I mean, I went on a TV show not long ago, and the interviewer was being, I think, a little bit controversial with me, and he said, why should, professional advisors care? What's it got to do with financial advisors? And I said to him, it's got something to do with everybody. Everybody, me as a sister, as a daughter, as a friend, everybody. And I think that's what's absolutely key. And it's this coordinated community response to this as a horrific form of domestic abuse and violence.
Thanks, Michelle. So finally, just to end, we need to talk about some of the signs that we might see, or one might see if they're talking to a family member or a friend or in a professional situation, that might make them think this person is a victim of financial control specifically.
between 80 and 95% of those who are victim survivors of other forms of domestic abuse, physical, sexual, and emotional, 95% of them are in a financially controlling relationship. So I think it's quite a tricky one to say to somebody, these are the signs of financial control. But what I will definitely say is that if you can spot other things, in up to 95% of cases, you're also going to uncover financial control. So I think that's key.
Those sorts of behaviours will be things like somebody not being able to make a decision about what they wear, where they go, being worried and anxious all the time about what their partner or the other person is doing or where they are. Perhaps constantly feeling like they've got to check in with that person, or they're being checked in on by the other person when they're out socially. I certainly see in clients that come to see me in these types of relationships, they're constantly justifying their behaviours, almost like they're doing something wrong, when it's a perfectly reasonable step for them to have taken, and they justify it on the basis, like you alluded to earlier, that it's probably because I've had a bad day or I was a bit tired. So and going back to your statement about having a gut feeling, sometimes, and I think this does come with experience, certainly within my area, you do get a gut feeling about a situation, and I think you go with that gut feeling, and that usually you are correct.
Absolutely. And I think a couple to add to those signs, Kate, I think, a depletion in personal care. I'm not saying the word downtrodden particularly, but when, you might see somebody who was always really smart, took care of their appearance, and you can slowly see that care for themselves, that self-care. Because often what victim survivors do is self-sabotage. They almost deplete. So, for example, in the cases of things like sexual violence and domestic abuse, they actually make themselves look unattractive so that they don't draw attention to themselves. Also, another one would be constantly cancelling. Not being as reliable. And in the workplace, particularly, I think employers have a huge duty to really keep an eyeball on what's going on within their team. Because, if the stats are right, 1 in 4 women are a victim of, financial abuse, economic harm, and 1 in 7. So you have to think about how many people are you having in your own team. And my own team, the stats are going to stack up. So I think it's some depletion of behaviour, underperformance, like you say, not turning up, not being very reliable, making excuses, and almost a constant anxiousness, like almost a shake, like unsettled. I think is other signs as well. And I think, your gut instinct piece is right. And I think if any of us do, even if it's not in a professional capacity, if you're speaking to a friend or a family member, the way that I would advise that you approach it, or anybody would approach it, would be you would say to somebody, let's use a little dialogue between you and I, for example. Kate, when Brian, or whoever it might be, when Brian, almost wants you to, really fess up what you've spent in a day, right? That makes me feel really, really sad for you. Does that happen a lot? So what I've just done is I've said, I've seen what I've seen, how I feel, and then I've asked a question. I've not accused, I've not blamed, I've not pointed my finger. It's been very calm. It's been, and then if she said, no, you said to me, no, that doesn't, he's very busy, straight away, I know that you've instantly gone into defense mode. So I'm like, oh, interesting. Well, does he do that a lot? Or even if he does it a lot, are you okay with that? So it's almost a very unthreatening, very soft. I've left all my own frames of reference and my own views, to one side. Even if I hate this person and I can see what they're doing, I've approached it in a very calm, caring way. And I think the key thing is, and what I would definitely be teaching people to do is almost say to that person, well, that's okay. If you, I'm just saying you what I feel, and I'm telling you what I've seen. But if you ever want to talk about it, I am always here to listen without any judgment at all. And I think sometimes softening that sentence, because people will train and say, you must say without any judgment. I think it's a bit formal. Depends on the circumstances of the conversation. But I would say, Kate, I'll always be here for you to listen, to talk without any judgment at all. You only have to pick the phone up and I'm here. Then you have to leave it, unfortunately, unless that person, really does, be able to confide in a person, into you, whoever's asking the question. But what I would say is, if anybody believes that anybody is in any immediate danger, then it's an immediate phone call to the police. I think, any risk of death or injury, it becomes a criminal matter. Then it's then into dangerous territory. But I think there is a softer way to approach it, and that's how I would definitely broach it.
And in terms of signposting those individuals, obviously there's a whole raft of charities, professional organisations, hopefully people like myself in the legal profession that also are aware and experienced about reading some of these behaviours, people like yourself within the financial world. Where would you signpost somebody that came to you specifically to say, Michelle, this has been happening, I don't really know what to do?
Well, I think there's a couple of places. I mean, part of the work that we're doing is we created a financial abuse certification, because we wanted to train, and this is what got me into the space in the first place, is we wanted to train lawyers, accountants, professional advisors within this coordinated community response to be able to go through the training and evidence that they had a certain level of skill and ability and expertise, and they would be able to demonstrate on their company logos and their letterheads the financial abuse certification mark. I think there's also, which yet hasn't really taken hold, it's not fully launched, but it will soon be, is the new consumer vulnerability ISO standard. And, particularly even the conversations that we've been having about it from IBB's perspective. But I think, those organisations that demonstrate and can display that they have an understanding of consumers' vulnerabilities is a great place to seek out services, whether they've got the financial abuse certification and or the consumer vulnerability, mark of excellence. And then sort of in the more general sphere, you've got an amazing charity called Surviving Economic Abuse. And Dr. Nicola Sharp-Jeffs is the founder of that charity and has been pioneering in this specific area of economic and financial harm and abuse for several years now. And the work that they're doing, they had a huge impact on the Domestic Abuse Act, remarkable charity. And there are others that sit around it. They're all much more tuned in now to this whole piece around money used as a controlling mechanism, because it gives power and it can equally remove all power, and that's why and it's silent. Let's be honest, it's not a physical form of abuse. It's totally silent and it's totally behind closed doors, and it impacts everybody that, in any walks of life.
Thanks, Michelle. That's a great note to leave this episode on.
Pleasure. I can't imagine doing anything else. This is such an important subject and one that we can all play a huge part in.
And just for those that are listening that may be experiencing any form of coercive control or financial abuse, any type of abuse within a relationship, do feel free to contact either myself or Michelle or any of the charities and organisations that we've mentioned in today's podcast. Thanks again for listening to Law and More. Goodbye.